The Met Police has increased the number of armed officers around the capital following the suicide bomb attack in Manchester. The move, which has also seen more unarmed officers on the streets, came just hours after the terror attack at a concert late last night. The force here is now reviewing in detail all the plans for upcoming events in London. This includes smaller events and much bigger ones like the FA Cup final at Wembley and two big rugby matches at Twickenham this weekend. Our correspondent Simon Harris has the details.
The 4x4 parked in front of the Chelsea Flower Show is no ordinary police car. It's an armed response vehicle. The officers inside carry guns. Even here, the most genteel of events in London's social calendar, terrorism has cast its shadow. Sniffer dogs and security checks greet the crowds, but even after the appalling attack in Manchester, few had second thoughts about coming to Chelsea.
Obviously we feel awful for the people in Manchester, but you've got to live your life and we can't let them get us down.
I would be nervous on the tube now, the underground, I have to say, because you're very vulnerable down there. But out here in the Flower Show, no.
I was very enthusiastic to come here. I believe our security services will, look after us as best they can.
I sometimes think after these incidents that everybody's hyper-vigilant, so it might even be safer in a way.
Scotland Yard said more police and more of them armed would appear at public events like Saturday's FA Cup final.
Wembley is somewhere that we plan and prepare for a period of time, but we are reviewing all of the events, and as I say, we will be working with the event organisers to make sure we're confident we're doing everything we can around these events.
As the full horror of what happened at the Manchester Arena began to emerge, politicians put the general election on hold. Campaigning was suspended. In Downing Street, flags were lowered to half-mast and on official buildings across London.
All acts of terrorism are cowardly attacks on innocent people. But this attack stands out for its appalling, sickening cowardice, deliberately targeting innocent, defenceless children and young people who should have been enjoying one of the most memorable nights of their lives.
Ariana Grande's appearance in Manchester was part of her Dangerous Woman tour of almost 80 concerts on 5 continents. She was due to perform at the O2 Arena in North Greenwich on Thursday and Friday. As fans waited to hear if the shows would go ahead, officials at the O2 sought to reassure them. Security was stepped up here in the aftermath of the terror attack on the Bataclan Theatre in Paris in 2015. Fans arriving for shows are warned to expect airport-style checks. No one is allowed to bring in a large bag. Even so, Harvey Goldsmith, one of the country's most prolific music promoters, believes there will have to be a rethink.
What seems to have happened last night was to cause maximum damage when a euphoric crowd have had a great time are on their way out, and that's very difficult to deal with.
But the starkest lesson from Manchester may be, if terrorists are prepared to murder children, they could attack anywhere. And that must be the biggest worry for the authorities and organisers as London enters a summer of concerts, festivals and sporting events.
Some details are emerging tonight about the man, the suicide bomber behind this attack, the killer.
Yes, Nina, the most crucial thing the police have established is who the suicide bomber was. His name is Salman Abedi. He was 22. And here's the really interesting thing. According to sources in the United States, he travelled to Manchester from London yesterday before carrying out his murderous attack. What he was doing here precisely, we have no idea. His connection to London is still the subject of unconfirmed speculation. There are reports that his parents moved to London from Gaddafi's Libya to escape that regime, and it seems they later relocated to Manchester, where Abedi was born. Precisely what his connection to London is will now be the subject of intense scrutiny by Scotland Yard, and the police say they still don't know whether he was working alone or was part of a wider terrorist network.
Simon, for that update, thank you. Late last night, the UK terror threat level was raised to critical, meaning an attack may be imminent. By the morning, we could see the reality of what that looks like in London, the army back on the streets. At Downing Street, outside Buckingham Palace and in Westminster. It is 14 years since we saw tanks and troops at Heathrow, 10 years since the threat level was at its highest. Tonight we'll assess the impact. We have reporters at Stamford Bridge with news of Chelsea cancelling its victory parade and at the O2, where it's still unclear whether Ariana Grande's London dates will go ahead later this week after that suicide bomb at her Manchester concert. First, here's our correspondent, Simon Harris.
In many countries, this would not be unusual, but when armed soldiers appear on the streets of London, the message is clear. The authorities are worried. Just hours after the threat level was raised to critical, troops took up position at Westminster. Their task, to protect Parliament and other high-profile buildings which could be a target. The Mayor and his police chief sought to reassure Londoners.
No reason at all to be panicked, no reason at all to be alarmed. We're doing all that we can to keep Londoners and visitors safe.
I've just been talking to my officers. They're very comfortable to have their military colleagues next to them. I think the vast majority of the public will be utterly reassured to know that we have the ability to call upon and have called upon the military in this way.
It's not the first time the army has been drafted in because of a terrorism threat. In the wake of the 9/11 attacks in 2001, tanks appeared at Heathrow Airport.
Today we have 984 members of the military coming forward as requested by the police. They will be initially deployed in London but also in the rest of the country as requested, and they will form an important part of the defence going forward.
The soldiers' main role will be to act as armed sentries at the doors and gates. The arrival of the army will allow police officers who traditionally guard Parliament to be moved to other parts of London. And in another sign of the increased threat of an attack, the Palace of Westminster closed its doors to members of the public. Earlier this month, Parliament offered free tours to 18 to 24-year-olds to try to encourage younger voters to take an interest in the election. The tours have now been suspended, and private events like wedding receptions will not be allowed. The Manchester attack has focused attention on security at concert venues like the Royal Albert Hall, where Eric Clapton is due to perform tonight. Security expert Steve Park says fans can expect an extra layer of checks.
We are in a critical time in our security. It's never been this high. It's never been more serious. Clearly there's something else going on that perhaps we don't know about.
When tourists take pictures of soldiers guarding Buckingham Palace, they almost certainly expect red tunics and bearskins. Today they got khaki uniforms and loaded assault rifles. In Downing Street there were more troops. Behind all this activity is a question the police have yet to answer. Did the Manchester bomber act alone, or are there other members of his terrorist cell planning further attacks? Simon Harris, ITV News, Westminster.
Now, after a two-day pause following the attack in Manchester, election campaigning began again today, with UKIP launching its manifesto in central London after a poor performance in the local elections earlier this month, when previous strong support in places like Essex fell away. Leader Paul Nuttall said UKIP will be campaigning hard to win back people's votes. Well, among the measures in UKIP's manifesto, a pledge to scrap the HS2 rail project that would run from London to Birmingham. It would also block the expansion of Heathrow Airport and end the congestion charge and low emission zone in central London. It also said it would reduce net migration to zero, effectively meaning one in, one out for migrants. As our political correspondent Simon Harris reports, that last pledge is one that could have a huge impact in London.
You don't have to be Polish to work in a Polish restaurant, but it comes as no surprise to learn most of the chefs here are. The restaurant at Elephant and Castle was opened 7 years ago by a Canadian entrepreneur. Ian Cole says UKIP's immigration policy of one in, one out would devastate his business, but he's not opposed in principle to hiring British workers.
Over a period of time, and I'm talking 20 years, if we can change British kids' mentality towards serving, towards what it means to be a catering professional, then yes, it can be done. We can get more, if you like, ethnically British kids.
The restaurant has a workforce of 20. All but 4 of them are from countries outside of the UK. Hotels and restaurants don't just need foreign workers, they rely on them. Almost 2/3 of staff in London's accommodation and food industry come from abroad, and half of those are EU citizens. UKIP leader Paul Nuttall outlined his party's target of zero net migration at a news conference in central London. I asked him who would be allowed in.
People who can offer things to this country. I mean, if you've got the skills that this country needs, then please come here and work.
Do those skills include hotel cleaners, waiters, chambermaids?
Well, do you know, we've said that we'll have a moratorium on unskilled migration. But the point is, there's still nearly 1 million of our young people who are unemployed. What we need to do is get our own people back into work before we bring people in to do low-skilled jobs.
Do you know how much London relies on people from abroad working in the hotel and catering industry?
I'm sure it's a lot, but the point is, we've still got a lot of our own young people who are unemployed, and it's not good for any society to have nearly 1 million of its young people sitting at home and not going out to work.
The prospect of any clampdown on immigration rings alarm bells among many business leaders in London.
For a small business where they might just have a handful of members of staff, if they couldn't get access to the skilled workers that they need, clearly that is going to damage their business. It's going to stop their ability to grow.
Britain's decision to leave the EU and the almost certain end of freedom of movement is already having an impact. At the Polish restaurant, they're finding it harder to recruit the workers they want, as more and more Poles conclude their future is at home, not here. Simon Harris, ITV News, Elephant and Castle.